All right, so thank you for coming, and I would like to introduce Jim Judd. He's our first presenter as part of this series. Jim is currently a principal of Timpanogos Middle School and leads an amazing bus tour of the Valley for new school district staff every year. I got a chance to go on that as a parent a couple months ago, and it was so neat that it actually sparked this whole idea of telling our local story. And so thank you, Jim, for doing that. And so thank you so much for bringing it here to the library. We are privileged to have him share his knowledge about the Heber Valley, as well as the evolution of the schools here. We will have time after for questions and answers and socializing. Please mingle amongst ourselves because we want to get to know each other as well. We're a growing community, but we also want to get to know our neighbors and friends and family. So thank you so much, and thank you for your time, and please put your hands together to welcome Jim Judd.
All right, this is a little daunting for me. I don't know why I can get up in front of 1,000 kids and run an assembly, but looking at all of you makes me a little nervous. When they asked me to do this, I couldn't imagine who would want to come listen to me. And I told my kids about it, and they said the same thing. And then my wife said, I'll come. I'll be there. So I thought, great, so it'll be me and my wife, and then my mother-in-law called yesterday and needed my wife to go visit her in Fremont. And I'm like, great, now my wife's not even coming. So I'm very excited to see who's here. How this all began is in 2012, we were getting this influx of new teachers that were from outside of the valley. And we just felt as a group of administrators that we have a pretty unique, special thing here. And we wanted to somehow, with all these new teachers, get them to feel as excited, not just about going and teaching science or math or English to a bunch of kids, but to say, I want to be part of Wasatch County. I want to be part of the thing that makes this so special. So we started this bus tour, and we would just go around and tour the buildings. And then that just kind of evolved over time, and I started to hear stories about this. I'm like, oh, I'm going to include that in the bus tour. And then I started hearing stories. So I will give this disclaimer. I'm pretty confident about 90% of what I'm saying. Okay? If there's things that you're like, I don't think that's true, it may be that I've heard it from the wrong source. But when I was asked to do this, I was telling Kate earlier, this has been a tremendous amount of fun for me to dig deep into the history of education in just our little county. And I found some cool things that at least I thought were cool. So hopefully you will too. And I see quite a few familiar faces here, and some I taught your kids way back when they were in 8th grade, and so this is great. The other thing I would like to say is, some of you, I saw the dates on when you graduated. You may have stories. This is a place where we can share some of those. So if we show a picture, and I had people emailing me just from the advertisement saying, hey, that was my ancestor that was driving that bus. And so those stories enrich. So feel free at some point, if you know something about one of these things, I think all of us would love to hear it too. And I may get included in the bus tour if it's a good story. Okay, because I'm an educator, I always have a purpose of what I'm going to try and convey here. So I do want you, as you're listening to this stuff, to think in your mind, is there a public purpose for public education? Because obviously as a public educator, I'm very committed to the concept of public education. I've been teaching for 30 years at some form or another, and I'm a big believer in this, and so as we see the evolution of education in our county, I hope that you can start to formulate why did it evolve this way, and what is the public purpose of public education. And we're going to hit on some kind of big ideas that drive public education, and you'll see it as it evolves here in our history. So we need to go back to the first kind of concept of public education. So how many of you have been on the Freedom Trail in Boston? So a few of you. So as you're doing the Freedom Trail, you'll cross this. It's a plaque in the pavement of where they started the Latin school. The Latin school was an experiment in Boston where they would levy a tax to all the citizens of Boston, and then they would take that tax and fund a school. And the agreement was anybody who wanted to go to school could go to school whether you could afford it or not. And at the time, this is revolutionary in the world. No other place in the world that I can find had this idea that everybody puts in a little so that every kid could go to school. Soon after, this is in the late 1600s, and soon after this, Philadelphia did the same thing. So this is a little bit of an editorial from me, but when I look at the founding of America, and this is a celebration of America's 250th birthday, there's no small coincidence to me that the ideas came out of Boston and Philadelphia. Because at the time of the turn of the century through the 1700s, they would have had arguably the most educated citizenry anywhere on the planet. And this is because so many kids had access to school. And so the first kind of key principle with public education is this concept of access. And those two communities, Boston and Philadelphia, were the beginning of it. So some famous graduates of the Latin School: John Hancock, Robert Payne, Sam Adams, and Ben Franklin. And all these guys had a pretty heavy role in the origin of our country. Graduates of the Latin School. Okay, now we're going to fast forward to our little county. And I feel like we could do some due diligence before we get into schooling in our county and just kind of set the stage of why schooling started. So if we're going to go back into the mid-1800s, then the indigenous group that are here are the Timpanogos band of the Shoshone Indians. And the chief at the time is Chief Tabiona. And you can look up a little bit about him, but I just think it's important to know that there were a group of people who interacted with the people here and helped shape this. If you go to our school district building, our office building, just a block north of the post office, on the corner of that, there's a plaque to Chief Tabiona and Joseph Murdoch, who is one of the original settlers here, where they signed the peace treaty together right on that spot. And then across the street is Joseph Murdoch's house, where they went across the street, according to what I can gather, went up to the second floor and smoked a peace pipe together to end the hostilities between each other. Chief Tabby is buried in the Heber City Cemetery, and you can go see his gravestone. This is just a side tangent. There's going to be a couple of side tangents, but this is what I found in learning about this. There's this story, this myth about Timpanogos. Obviously, the Timpanogos Mountains shape and frame our whole valley, right? We love it. If I could go back in time and tell the settlers, I would have said, take this grid system and just tilt it just a little bit. Let's give everybody a view of Timpanogos Mountains for the sunset every night. Well, there's a story that the silhouette of Timpanogos is an old Timpanogos Indian story of a princess who was laid to rest, and there's this beautiful story about her and her star-crossed lover and all this type of stuff. Well, I hate to burst your bubble. That was not a legend of the Timpanogos Indians. It was created by Eugene Reeve. Eugene Reeve lived in Provo, and he was a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And they decided, how can we get more people, tourism, to come to Utah County? And so they created the tale of, or the legend of Timpanogos, in order to attract people to come see these mountains. It's still a good story, right? But it's not rooted in Native America. Okay, the origin of European people getting here to our county, and some of you may speak French, so I'm probably going to slaughter his first name, but I'm going to say Etienne. How's that? Any French speakers out there?
That's correct.
Close enough for this crowd? Okay. Etienne Prevost was a French fur trader, and he was the one that mapped out the Provo River whole watershed. He mapped all this out from the headwaters up at the Uintas all the way down to Utah Lake. So this name Provo comes from Etienne Prevost, and this river that he mapped out becomes a major part of our history here. In fact, this used to be called the Provo River Valley, and was called that all the way up, you're going to see, into the early part of the 1900s, and then just got too confusing to people to have Provo City and Provo River Valley up here, and so they started just transforming the name to the Heber Valley. But it was all named after this guy, Etienne Prevost. And now there's all kinds of things named after Prevost, right? When the original settlers came here, they had a hard time with this river being meandering like this. And they took the point to kind of straighten the river, because a straight river is easy to manage than a meandering river. And it wasn't fully until Jordanelle was built that they decided to try and get the ancestral route of the Provo River back to its meandering state. And so some of you know how that, so we're here when they started to do the Provo River Reclamation Project. Okay, this is a view of Fort Utah in the mid-1800s. So this would be where Provo City is eventually going to be. So the mountains that you see there in the background would be the mountains where BYU kind of sits at there on the right, and then Timpanogos over on the left. So access to Heber Valley didn't come through the Park City route, it came through the Utah County route. And looking for timber, a group of loggers came in over Snake Creek. Came over the Snake Creek Pass, and that's where they kind of saw this Provo River Valley and said, this ought to be a place that we want to go to. So the connection to the Wasatch Front originally was all through Provo Canyon to get up here. So they sent two people up to kind of scope it out. A guy named Aaron Daniels and William Wall. So Daniels Canyon is named after Aaron Daniels, not to be confused with Daniel, which is a different name. Daniel is named after the Daniel Irrigation Company. Daniels Canyon is named after Aaron Daniels. And then William Wall, who eventually left the Fort Utah Provo area and settled into what we now call Wallsburg after William Wall. And we have a statue to commemorate William Wall at our city park. And then just getting some names here. Heber, there were a lot of different communities, the biggest one of course being Heber. And a lot of the original settlers of Heber experienced Heber Kimball while they were converted to the LDS faith in England. And when they came here, Heber Kimball never lived here. he lived in Salt Lake, and you can actually see his house at this is the place monument. They've moved his house up there. But Heber Kimball had so many converts that were settled here that they, in tribute to him, wanted to name their town after him. So it was called Heber's City. And he traveled up here and he asked everyone, I want you to live in such a way that I'll never be disgraced by having the city named after me. So Heber City eventually just became Heber City, but it was after Heber C. Kimball, one of the early Mormon pioneers. Okay, just by raise of hands, I need to know my audience here. How many Midway people do we have here? Okay, so I'm gonna tone down my Midway jest. Normally when I do this bus tour, I have a Kelly with me. And so normally there's a bit of comparing and contrasting the origin of these two communities. So just know that there might be a little bit of jest here. The Midway people will probably tell you that Midway is called that because they are midway to heaven. Okay? That is not how Midway got its name. There were two settlements in Midway, Stringtown and Mound City. Mound City is where a lot of immigrants from Switzerland went, and they went there and found maybe what they felt was midway to heaven at the time. And then Stringtown was a little bit farther on down the road. When the Indian entanglements happened with Chief Tabby and some of the others, all the towns in Utah were asked to make a fort. Just in case hostilities happened, the settlers could go and be safe in their fort. So we had a Fort Heber, and there's a whole walking tour you can take with the Fort Heber route, and you saw Fort Utah. Well, the two communities in Midway couldn't agree with where the fort ought to be. And the disagreement got significant enough that they had to have mediation come in. And the mediation came in and said, okay, we're going to build this fort right in between the two of you. And they planted it and said this is midway between the two communities, and they built Fort Midway, which was meant to be right there. After the peace treaty was signed, I guess they figured this is the best spot to have Swiss days. And we're not going to move back to the other places. And so right where Swiss days happens would be right where Fort Midway existed. So it wasn't really because they felt midway to heaven, it was more because of domestic disputes that had to be mediated.
Are there fort remnants here or there?
They have markers, and most communities in the state of Utah will have markers of where the corners were of the fort, but there's no more remnants that I'm aware of. I don't know if anyone knows differently. Okay, I tell you all this history to kind of set up where education started. So we've got the Mormon pioneers who've come out. We've got models in parts of America where there's this concept of public education. But really, for most of the 1800s, the Mormon pioneers were more worried about just establishing communities and getting themselves in a place where they could live in some level of prosperity. But they did value education. And so they started building schools. And there were lots of little communities. And each of these communities had a school built. These were all private schools. You had to pay tuition to get into them. And they all hired a teacher. And they were just full-on K-12, well not K-12, K-8 schools. Or really just anybody who wanted to learn. So little kids, teenagers, older people, all in the same one-room schoolhouse. So I don't remember exactly where this schoolhouse was located, but this was in the county, and you can see the students that attended there. At the height of this phase, there were 22 independent private schools in the county, all with competing teachers, and some schools were more popular than other schools based on who they hired to be a teacher. And of course, if you had a more popular teacher, you could charge more for your tuition. And so it became something that those that had some means, but the value of education was important. Well, the state of Utah decided that this was an ineffective model. So in 1867, the territory's legislature passed a law which allowed the model that they saw in places like Boston to happen, where you could tax everybody in your community in order to have a school that had some level of regulation. And so again, we have this concept here of access. Like if we want to be a strong community, there has to be access for everybody to go to school. And so this started to become what we would consider public education here in Wasatch County. And so in order to kind of get this together, the community voted and they elected, you're going to have to help me with the first name here, Mr. Wooten. Attawal. Okay. And we have a descendant of Attawal right here, right?
Great-great-grandfather.
There you go. So Attawal Wooten Sr., okay, you're going to have to tell me too. Being from Nephi, it's Wooten, Jim.
Yeah, Wooten.
Okay. I don't need to say Wooten?
Most people do pronounce
Okay.
that.
Okay, well, I'm going to stick with my Puyallup roots and say Wooten. So Attawal Wooten Sr. was elected to be the superintendent of schooling for Wasatch County. And his job was to bring some sense of order and regulation to all of this. They started the first graded school. And by graded, I mean first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. So remember, in the one-room schoolhouse, everybody's just sitting in the room together. So we're going to get this graded by age. Okay, so now we're back to this concept of access, that it seems ineffective to have this 6-year-old with this 14-year-old learning at the same rate. So we're going to grade the schools into that. And the first principal of the graded schools was a guy named Henry Aird. And these were all just K-8 schools, not even K-8. These were 1-8 schools back at the time. And that was only in 1892 that concept came about. So once there was some kind of organization to this, and they decided to grade them, each individual community was still its own independent school district. So if you were in Center Creek, there was a Center Creek School District with its own school. If you were in Wallsburg, there was a Wallsburg School District with its own school. If you were in Charleston, there was a Charleston school. Every little community had its own school district. And Superintendent Wooten was in charge of all this, but they all had their own governing bodies that made this happen. So this is just a series of some of the pictures you can see there. This is Center School. And you can just see the variety of these schools. If you're noticing like a similarity in the architecture with some of these, the architect was a guy named Truman Angel. His grandfather would have been the architect of the Salt Lake Temple. What's that?
I thought it was his father.
Oh, it may have been. But he kind of came across this, and you'll see this architecture throughout the entire state. Lots of different schools were built using this same kind of floor plan. So like I said, back then, 8th grade was considered all you needed for education. So none of these schools went past this. So in this picture, you see 8th grade graduation from one of the schools. Now the faculty is in here, okay? So they weren't really looking that old back then. This is a faculty member, that's a faculty member, that's a faculty member. Of course, I work in a middle school now, and there are some kids shaving already at that age. But that's still an impressive mustache. But you can see the kids, and this was the pinnacle of education. There wasn't this concept of needing to do anything other than pretty much reading and writing. There was some arithmetic that was taught there, but really outside of just that basicness, schooling was meant to teach you how to read and write. And that was about all that they felt they needed to. The concept of what grade level was still very unregulated. There wasn't any kind of state organization giving core curriculum or things like that. So in the early 1900s, a young student named J. Reuben Clark Jr., BYU people, this may be more famous to you because there's a building named after him down at BYU. J. Reuben Clark Jr. came up to Wasatch County and he tried to start something for anybody older than 8th grade to have a level of education. And this is his first group of students right here. And so this was the first, and you can see him in the middle at the top. He wasn't that much older than the students at the time. And this was the first beginnings of this idea that education could be more than just learning to read and write in 8th grade. He eventually got the interest enough, and then he ended up leaving and going down and made a big career for himself throughout the state of Utah and became a big name in the LDS church, in the education system throughout the entire state of Utah. But he got his origins here in Wasatch County. So they started this, they went through back to all the 8th graders that were in school at this time, and this would have been about 1907. They went, all these 8th graders, and they asked them, how many would be interested in going to school past 8th grade? And they got 75 kids saying, I'd be interested in going to school past 8th grade, going into what they then called year 1, which would be what we would call 9th graders now. And then they had 25 kids that were past the year 1 age that said, we would love to come back and get more education. So they started all these independent school districts. The communities all got together, and this was hotly debated because different communities had different populations, and different communities had different amounts of money. And so this was very hotly debated. If we're going to consolidate this into one school district, where's the buildings going to be? Is everyone going to pay their fair share? This idea that there's the haves and the have-nots, and what does access look like to everybody? If I live in Center Creek and I'm expected to go to school in Heber, what's going to be my pathway of transportation versus the kids in Heber who can just walk there? And this wasn't an easy sell to do this. But in 1908, they agreed to make one school district, Wasatch County School District, and start a high school. So the high school was right here in this upper floor of the bank building. And that was the first Wasatch High School. And you can go up there now. I don't think anything's upstairs there, so you can go see this. There were 2 rooms up there. All the boys went to one room, and all the girls went to the other room. And they learned things that pertained, I guess, only to that gender that was important. I don't know. But it was in this upper room, or the upper floor of this building right here. And these guys right here are the original faculty of those first years of the high school. So on top of going to the high school level, the next question was, what should education be besides reading and writing? And this is where they start to get the concepts of arts. Is it important for people to learn art? Is it important for people to learn music? What does math look like past basic arithmetic? For those of you who want a little, I got a former current retired math wizard right here. Anyone know where the math started that we call, your kids now in school call math today, where that all came from? It all changed in 1957. Russia launched a satellite. And they beat America to space with Sputnik. And the whole nation said, we cannot lose the space war to the Soviet Union. And it fundamentally changed math and public education because we got to find where all the new crop of engineers is going to be. So that level of heavy math wasn't even something anybody really thought of until 1957. But it's like, we're got to beat them to space, and that if we're going to beat them to space, it's going to come from public education. And it's going to come by making everybody learn math that they say, when am I ever going to use this? You're going to use it when you're a rocket scientist beating the Russians to space. So,
Mr. Judd?
yeah,
So, I went to school in California, and...
that's all right.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, in 1961, they introduced SMSG, which was called New Math. And that's what they introduced first into the junior high. And I was in 7th grade. And what's interesting is, that is exactly when we started getting algebraic equations. And now you look at kids in kindergarten that are already working on equations.
Yeah.
But I didn't, having even lived at that time and being forced to read current events every Friday, I have never heard that before. That came from Sputnik. That's fascinating.
Yeah, well, that was definitely the catalyst because, and those of you who were around in the Cold War, that was real pressure
Yeah.
back then. And the idea that if we couldn't beat them to space, the American dream as we know it would be ended and we would all be under communist rule,
Yeah, that's
right? But what's fascinating to me is the solution was public ed. That's the way we're going to beat them. Or at least that was the intention, yeah.
Yeah, that this is the first time I've heard about that being one of the roots of our current mathematics. And so when kids are asking, when will I ever use this? The answer sounds like it'd be, math is being used on you to sort you out into those who have the aptitude for engineering and science, and those of you who will find another
Okay,
route.
so what was the first question we started with? What's the public purpose of public education? And definitely in this case, there was a deliberate attempt in public education for international relations that we could beat people to space. So yeah, public ed was being used to create scientists.
Since the time of the Greek and Romans, math has been taught as a means to teach ordered, logical thinking. And that is probably the most important thing most students take out of a math class, is the ordered, logical thinking. Even if they don't ever
This is
use
exactly
it
the answer
correctly.
I would think you would say. Is that there is value in learning point slope formula, even though I haven't used it yet. Okay, well, so part of this whole thing is what does high school education look like? So the guy there in the middle, his name is Owen Whitaker. He was a musician. And he was one of the ones here in Wasatch County that said music is definitely part of what kids should get in education. Pretty soon that building became way too small, very quickly. And so they went to build the first Wasatch High School. And again, this was a huge controversy. If you think building a second high school in the valley now was a controversy, building one was quite a controversy too, because these buildings have always been expensive. It's just relative to what people were living at the time. Just by a side note here, I mean, I love the fact that you can see some of the old bikes right here. This architecture right here of the entrance to the school with the W on top, when they built the high school that's just right here next to the library, they wanted to keep that heritage there. So when you look at the entrance to the athletic portion of the high school, it's that. Even down to the gold W sitting on top of it. So there were deliberate attempts to pay homage to the people who did this, even in our current architecture now. So this is where everybody started to go. So remember, it started in 1908, went year one, 1909, and by the time you get to 1913, you have your first graduating class. and we happen to have their yearbook right here. And a few of these pictures come from this yearbook of the first graduating class of 4 years after 8th grade people. Here are some of the, what's that?
Where was the school located down?
Oh, great question. So this is where City Park is. And I'll actually show you an aerial of that. Where the City Park is where that building was, right there. So really from that bank block, it's just down the road, just a little bit. So in the newspapers at the time, because this was so hotly debated, when it finally got passed and people agreed to build it, there were a lot of sentiments from kids that they wanted to put into writing to their community. So this person said, 9 rahs for our new building. Last Tuesday, March 9th, the taxpayers of this high school district declared by a decisive vote of 338 to 60 that we have shown ourselves worthy of a more commodious building. You don't really use the word commodious anymore. I challenge you the rest of this week to use it in a sentence and see how it goes. All praise to the high school supporters. Thank you, Pa. You'll never regret it. You've given us room to live and learn. Now watch us grow and develop. Students, our parents have done their part. Now it is our turn to prove that we are made of the right stuff. So you can see what a moment this was to have a legitimate high school for these kids to go to. And so there's a view. This is the original high school right here. This is the addition, and I'll show you a color photo of this later. Just by raise of hands, how many went to this school? Okay, so I wish we could go in and see where you carved your names.
Just one comment.
Yeah.
The building on the left, that was built in 1912, and that was a pot building. And that was the first one. And the one on the right, that was built in 1927, brick.
Okay.
And the hallway between them, you can see the hallway,
Yeah.
so you could go from one building to the other. And I taught in that building for quite a few years.
What did you teach?
Well, at that time they moved I went to school there 6 years. And then I taught 6th grade when they moved it into that school for 2 years.
Oh, wow.
Later on.
Well, I bet you've got some stories. And from what I read, this was the seminary.
That's right.
The only baptismal fund in Heber.
Yes.
Oh, really?
The county.
So if the kids were bad in school, you'd take them over and get them
I'm going back to
clean. That was your discipline.
Those were the good old days.
So, Jim, which is Main Street? This?
Main Street's right here.
Straight across.
Yeah. Where these cars are parked here is where all the food trucks are now on Thursdays in the summertime. But that's great. I'm so glad you're here.
And the football field was right behind it there for many years, many
Yeah.
years.
And we've got a football helmet from that high school sitting here.
And what happened to the building?
Well, that's a great question. We'll get to that here in a minute. Just because some of this you may want to know, this is one of the original faculty members from those early years, and his name is J.R. Smith. And he left Heber Valley and moved down to Salt Lake and became big in state legislature. But he had descendants here, and fast forward a few decades, his descendants sold the land to the school district for an elementary on the condition that they name it after J.R. Smith. So on our new high school, there's a quote that they got from this yearbook that says, "Deep in the little valley of the Provo," so at the time they were still calling this the Provo Valley, "safely guarded on all sides by these mighty sentinels, with God's blue sky above us, we have planted our school, our home for years to come." And again, in trying to make sure that these stories continue, that's carved in the rock right now in front of our high school. So current students can see the origins of that, of the original high school. This is the theater, the cast of Nathan Hale, 1910. And I don't know what you think, but when I first thought this, I'm like, some of them look way too old to be high schoolers. And I know that there might be some faculty in there, but this is another point of what is high school education supposed to be? Well, part of it is this idea of arts, so performing arts. We talked about O.A. Whitaker, and it was a big thing for him to try and get the community to agree that music education was not frivolous. And so the way he did that is you could schedule the high school band to perform at anything you wanted. So church outings, family reunions, parties, you could get the high school band to come and perform, and that was his way of showing the community there's value in having music being performed.
Can I ask, what was the population back then? Around 08 or 1910?
The population of the county?
Well, who's ever drawing in all the students?
Yeah. Well, I don't know the population of the whole high school, but there were 75 kids in that first year one that signed up to do it, and then
I'm thinking.
and then
like,
here's your 1910 graduating class.
I mean, how many people were like actually living in Wasatch and Midway and Daniel and Charleston?
I'm not sure
I guess
on that
I
one.
wonder.
If you go back to the quote where they talked about the voting, I don't know who got to vote. Sorry. But that was your voting
Oh,
block there.
okay.
But again, I don't know who was part of the
I'll
vote.
go to Chat GPT, probably well.
Yeah, you can go to AI, it'll tell you. I'm just glad I was a teacher before Google was invented because, like I said, I'm pretty confident about 90%.
There were about 5,000 students, or 5,000 residents in Wasatch County.
Okay.
5,000.
According to the interwebs, about 5,000 people. So there's your basketball team, and the thing that just cracks me up about this picture is who posed them. That they're all just kind of in like this Congo line.
It's so great to recreate.
And you know those boys are just like flex, flex, flex. This is the dance company that performed their dancing. And again, here are the graduates. So looking at some of the names there, Murdoch, McDonald, Luke, Ritchie, another Murdoch, Duke, Clegg, Rasbin. You can see some of those early names there. Just because I'm curious, does anyone have a relative on there? Yeah? Which one?
Josephine Murdoch,
That's so cool.
the Cleggs, Fred and Luella.
Okay, well, you were part of education pioneering then.
And also Douglas Murdoch.
Wow. We talk about state championships, and we talk about things like wrestling and soccer, where we've become fairly dominant. This is our first state champion, and she competed in oratory. She was a state champion twice, Isla Fisher. Mon was a maiden name later. And this competition was in Salt Lake, and it was quite a feat because, remember, the access to the Wasatch Front was down Provo Canyon. And so her getting to Salt Lake was not as simple as taking a bus ride to a speech debate. She had to go physically down there, stay down there and compete. In the current high school, they have a mural of the first 100 years of Wasatch. Her body and face are on the far right end because she's our first state champion with that. So again, going back to the public purpose, at this point in high school, you get this idea that we're creating people who can speak and articulate and communicate. So it's gone past just this reading and writing. Okay, somebody emailed me about this picture, and Medler, I forget her first name, but said that this is, that bus driver was one of, she's a descendant of that bus driver.
Yeah. He was my uncle.
Yeah,
Yeah, Jim Casper, and the one on the right is Wilson Young.
there you go. So, back to how contested everything was. One of the things that became an access issue was transportation. If we're going to say education is important, and we're going to say there's a public purpose for it, then we have to remove barriers to kids who can't get to school. So we're going to have to bus. But the community that was having their taxes raised at that time just could not fathom buying a vehicle that sits unused during the day. And so they compromised and they bought flatbed trucks with removable shells. And so they would put the shell on, there's no seats in there. They'd put the shell on, transport the kids to school, take the shell off, and then people could use it on their farms during the day. And then when it's time to take the kids home, put the shell back on, and then drive the kids home. So it was this kind of compromise between building or use of things that taxpayers were paying for the public good, as well as educating kids. Anyway, it's a great picture. That's so cool that you know the names of those guys.
I might mention there also they had another bus before this, and Jim Casper there was also the driver of that. But I remember riding in that wooden type bus, and the seats ran parallel all the way on both sides, so the middle was open. There were no seat belts, so when they went around the corner too fast, you would land out in the aisle between the seats.
That's what we call opportunity corners. Yeah, depending on who you sat by. So just a little trivia, school buses still don't have seat belts.
Oh, is that right?
And they are still considered the safest mode of transportation in the country. And the yellow of a school bus is patented. No one is allowed to have that color yellow because nationally everybody knows what that color yellow means and what you're supposed to do. But because of the size of these, seat belts aren't necessarily helpful in an accident because rarely do kids get hurt on a school bus just because they're so big.
And did you go to school in the winter? Because obviously that was cold.
Well, I'm sure that they have the same heating philosophy that my grandpa had, which was, it'll take forever to warm up, so just deal with it until we get there. So, but no, that was their winter transportation too. Okay, there's a color picture right there of the high school where you see the two buildings and the seminary. So someone may know was around when this was decided that this no longer was adequate. We didn't want this building. Either it was just too old to maintain or something, and so, before that, in 1923, they built the Central School. Just by raise of hands, how many went to school in the Central School? Okay. 2 years at the Central School. This is now where Heber City Police Department is. So it was just across the street from the high school.
So was the elementary.
That school was built because in 1923, the school that was there burned.
Burnt down.
And so the picture of that is quite impressive.
Yeah. So this was the building they built to replace that burnt down building.
And then they added on to it later.
Yeah. And this at one point even became the district office. I mean, they used this building for quite a few things until they finally tore it down. And like I said, this is where the police station is. One other story when we talk about access. In the Depression, none of these schools had kitchens attached to them. And when we hit the Depression, we go back to this concept of access. And if we value public education, and we say that there's a purpose for public education, the kids coming hungry is something we have to solve. And so the superintendent at the time was Superintendent Nielsen, and he decided that part of the school's job was to feed kids when they were there. So until they could get kitchens built in all these schools, local neighborhoods made lunches for the kids and brought them every day until they could get those kitchens built there. And now it's an essential part of school, not just feeding them lunch, but for a large part of kids, we feed them breakfast too. Because the kids sitting there hungry, it's going to be difficult. And if the kids leave the system without learning what they learn, we have this agreement that our communities won't be as healthy with an uneducated group. Okay, so the high school decided they needed a new location. And I don't know, those of you who were part of that, if you have any stories of what was entailed in taking those buildings down at the city park. But they moved here in 1964.
Yeah, they kept the old high school on Main Street there for junior high for quite a few years.
And 6th grade for 2 years.
Yes.
Where you were teaching.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, so then they moved over to this
It was
building
still a junior high when they built this.
when they built that.
Yeah. They didn't tear it down till, well, probably 10 years before they tore that one down.
So this was the home of Wasatch High up until 2009, and I was around at the decision of that one. They had to get schools off Main Street. That was just, Main Street was just getting too busy, too crazy to keep a school there. Oh, did I say Siri? Is that was my phone or something?
Was that the reason?
So in 2009, in 2009 they built this building over here, just to the north of this, and as a final tribute to the learning that went on, the students formed a big chain, and they moved the entire library, one book at a time, student to student, taking it over to the new school.
Remind me where this one was.
This was where Carl's Jr. is now.
Okay.
This is right on Main Street,
Yeah.
6
I
South.
mean, I had been to this building, of course, but I just don't know.
And if any of you have a better picture, I've struggled to find a better picture of this building. I would love
Not
it.
even in your books.
Yeah, I've combed through the yearbooks. This is the best picture I could find. I guess no one wanted an aerial of this one, wasn't it?
One year, a graduating class stole a chicken. Remember the chicken that was on something? I can't remember. And put it on top of the roof. There's got
What she's saying is, at one point, she stole a chicken.
I was probably a freshman.
No, it wasn't me. It was just some guys I knew.
No.
I know how this
I
works.
mean, that would
for
have
me.
been totally fun, but I wasn't part of that. The class before me got in a lot of trouble, so our class didn't get to do anything.
Yeah. Okay, and now we've got all these Old Mill Elementary, or Midway Elementary, which is currently our oldest building that we still have, and we still have the fantastic tradition of Midway of ringing the bell. Back in the day when schools all had bells, they still have their bell. J.R. Smith Elementary, Heber Valley Elementary, Daniels Canyon Elementary, Rocky Mountain Middle School, Timpanogos Middle School, Wasatch High School, and then in a few months, Deer Creek High School. So that's kind of just some of the things, the evolution of schooling in our county. I appreciate the comments, and again, I won't know all the questions, but I can tell answers to questions if you have, but I think we might have some people who do know. But anybody have any questions about anything?
Jim, I love the story about why Old Mill and Mill Road is called Mill Road, if you want to, I
Yeah.
don't know if everyone knows that.
So every community, like one of the first things you had to figure out is how you were going to mill your grains. And so typically that was done by finding some water source and putting a mill there. And so right on 12th East Mill Road and Center Street, there's a little stream that comes out of Lake Creek there, and that was where the first grist mill was that gave Mill Road its name. And so when they named Old Mill Elementary, it's a nod to that original grist mill. And you can just imagine, these original mills were hugely important in any community because the grain's not going to do you any good if you don't have a way to process it. So that's where that came from. And we talked about where J.R. Smith got his name. Daniels Canyon, we talked about where it got its name. Midway, we talked about where it got its name. And Heber Valley talked about where it got its name. There is a technical issue I have, being a former science teacher, about Rocky Mountain Middle School's name. Because there are no Rocky Mountains in Utah. The Rocky Mountains are in Colorado. We are the Wasatch Mountains here, but no one asked me.
What's the new school, the new high school called?
The new high school is Deer Creek. And that went through quite a rigorous process of going back and forth. And when they have tours, which I assume they will have open public tours, one thing I think is well noted if you go there is the inside of that common area is meant to look like a train station. The train was a huge deal because it was the lifeblood of the Wasatch back to the Wasatch Front. Every community back then, the goal of Brigham Young and the Mormon pioneers was each community have a central product that they can give to the whole good. Well, the growing season in Wasatch County wasn't good enough for pretty much anything, and so it became sheep. And so the whole valley was raised on this. It was a sheep culture. There was one small exception to this, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the sheep culture was huge, and they would take the sheep and take them down the train through Provo Canyon. And so that, keeping the history alive in the architecture, they kept that train station kind of feel there, because that's right about where the trains were there. And you can still experience the thrill of transporting sheep if you ride the Heber Valley Railroad, and it goes about the same speed as it did when they were moving those sheep down. The one exception was there was one little community that did raise cattle in Midway, and they were right next to where Midway Elementary was, and so when they made their mascot, they called themselves the Wranglers after that small group of people that were cattle.
So it's my understanding that Provo, Richfield, some of the other towns on the other side of the Wasatch had public education much sooner than they did up here in Heber.
Yeah.
What do you think was the reason for the delay of public education up here? In other words, was it because it was primarily a farming community and maybe not as emphasized as it was on the other side of the Wasatch?
So I asked that question to my grandfather, and he wasn't from here, he's from Colville, where the Judds were from, and he only went to 8th grade.
Yeah.
And his answer to me was just the mindset of a more rural agricultural place was just not post 8th grade needing. And so like when you look at this yearbook, the 1913, one of the things in the back is an advertisement to Brigham Young University. So I think my guess would be is that the places that had this idea of universities and even higher education fueled the high school movement to get kids past. And I just don't, I would guess if it's similar to Colville as it was here, there just wasn't the vision at the time that we needed to move outside of our county for any reason. But I don't know for sure on that.
Well, I know that my husband's grandmother, she was from North Ogden, and she didn't go beyond 8th grade, neither did her sister. Instead, everybody ran to Hollywood for a little bit and had a good time. But I do know on Provo, I mean, well, I'm really trying to place these dates. Like my grandfather, he was raised in Cardston, Alberta, but he was already an educator, and went back to Cardston to teach back around 1910.
Mhm.
My grandmother, who was raised in Richfield, was already graduated from high school, and she went up to BY Academy,
Yeah,
and then went up to Cardston, well, actually it was Knight Academy up in that area, beyond Cardston. And so, but honestly, I mean, when, even in the early 70s, I knew kids from Heber that had come to Berkeley, and, but I remember them saying that the town was only like 3,000, maybe 5,000 people. And then, until it wasn't.
yeah.
You know? But I'm thinking, if you have a more rural community, it's so important to contribute to the farming and the labor that's going on, and anything beyond that would be maybe considered excessive
Yeah.
to what you're
And
doing.
I would guess it's similar to any kind of public service thing. The bigger the population, the easier it is to invest money in things that service, like public transport, any of those kinds of things.
And yet, in Europe, when they really did just go up to 8th grade, but then they all spent 3 to 5 years being educated in professions,
Mhm.
whether they were tailors or something else. And so it's, you would have thought that maybe would have come with some of the Europeans that first came to the valley, but maybe not. I mean, it's just curious.
Well, there definitely was a push for education because you had these Mormon pioneers
Yeah.
with all these private independent schools. So it wasn't that they didn't value education, but they definitely didn't see it pass.
Yeah, well, it's remarkable what they
Yeah.
accomplished.
Yeah,
Does anyone know when the county was set up? Was that when Utah became a state? I'm trying to visualize, I guess Summit County was going through the same thing over there
yeah.
about their education thing as this county was.
You know, that might be my next tangent research thing, is when were the county lines made? As a territory, right, we didn't become a state until 1896. So I don't know if that needed to have some level, and the federal government really whittled the state down from its intended size. So I don't know where county lines officially started.
It was officially created March 3rd, 1862. Heber, Wasatch County.
Wasatch County.
It was carved out of parts of Utah and Summit County, so those were already established.
There you go.
1862.
Before they were a state.
Yes, yeah.
So they were counties in the territory.
Do you know if the architect of the Park City Library and the civic building up in Park City are the same as the old high school? Because they're very similar.
I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that back in the 1800s, architects were rarer. And so these guys that would create these things, you see them all through the state, certain models that were just viewed as effective. And I think a lot of that also would depend on what different communities had access to for building. Obviously in Heber, we had the red quarry, you know, up in the Lake Creek area that was mined for a lot of the architecture here.
Because the Marsack building was the Marsack School. So where City Hall is in Park City, that was originally Marsack School until they moved it over to where the library is now, which is Antiochus.
And I truly don't know a lot about Park City. My grandfather told me that that's where they went when they were being bad.
Yes.
Because you could get access to free wine.
Yeah.
And so Park City was just always thought like that's where the bad stuff happens, so I steer away. Anything like that.
So there was that one photograph, I think was the first graduating class of 8th graders, and there were about a dozen boys and 2 girls.
Yeah.
Do you think in that community there were a dozen boys and 2 girls, or were girls less likely to go to school?
Well, so this graduating class would be small because if you remember in 1908, they started the first year ones, and there were about 75 of them. So this would have been kids old enough and educated enough to say we would be like the year 2, 3s, and there really wasn't a system for that. But you can see, I mean, what's in one?
He's talking about the 8th grade class.
Oh, the 8th grade class?
Yeah. Real early, one of your first
But if you look at the J. Reuben Clark photo,
Mm.
there are more girls
I
than boys.
did notice that.
This
too,
one,
yes, yeah.
this is the one where there's just two pictures.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, and I actually don't know which school this graduating class came from. A lot of these pictures I got from How Beautiful Upon the Mountains book, for those of you who have that book.